Happy Monday, everyone. Looks like we made it to another week. And that means a whole nother week of stories here on Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get you started with 5 more great stories. And this time, we're talking about third-person stories. So I hope you're ready for some tales of terror. Let's hear a story to start us off about a man who meets a woman on the internet and the strange relationship that comes from it. Let's hear a story about Lisa.
Good afternoon, beautiful. Paul had rushed home from work, just like he had every day for the past 2 weeks. Reagan and Frank had said something about drinks after their shift, but he'd barely heard them. He had only one thought on his mind, the same thing he had for the past 2 weeks. Lisa. "Man, you're falling way too hard for this gal," Frank had told him, as he made the usual excuses. "You don't even know what she looks like," he added, before Paul could make his escape. "Sure I do," Paul protested, and turned to go. 5'5", 100 pounds even, long brown hair, B-cup with mossy green eyes, and a love of classical music. Reagan had scoffed. "I didn't ask what her profile said, man." He'd rolled his eyes and took another puff off his cigarette. "I asked if you knew what she looked like. She looks like an angel, boys, and this angel's waiting for me." And with that, he'd been off. He'd rushed home through 2 blocks of busy Chicago streets to sink happily into his chair and find her online. Lisa. Just saying her name made his heart race. Lisa had found him, actually sought him out after reading something he'd posted on a forum. They started talking, and from day one it seemed like they had known each other for years. It seemed as though years themselves had passed by while she was with him, though it could have been seconds. Nothing else mattered when she was online. He went to bed later and later each night, not wanting to stop talking to her for a second. And strangely, she didn't seem to mind at all. She was as smitten with him as he was with her. A perfect match. "Hi, Polly. Rough day today?" She was so cute. After 2 weeks, Paul had been hard-pressed to find anything he didn't like about her. The way she called him Polly, the way she always asked about his day, the way she always remembered important things he'd told her, even when he couldn't, the way her words seemed to smile at him. She was something he'd always wanted. She was everything he'd always wanted. "Much better now that you're here, Lisa," he said. "Aw, you're such a teaser. I've been waiting for my Polly all day, and now I finally have you." "You sure do. I'm all yours, baby." The scream of the alarm clock brought him back to reality. It had been such a good night last night, but now it was time for another fun-filled day of work. Last night, just thinking about it made his heart race again. They had talked till almost dawn. He'd only stopped when his eyes had gotten heavy and finally betrayed him. She was a technician, his Lisa. She just kept on talking, kept on laughing, only wanting more of him. He felt his face redden as he lurched into the kitchen and turned on the tiny television by the counter. A man in a gray suit was pointing at a weather map and talking about the weekend weather as Paul poured milk on his sugar flakes. The man was finishing up his report as Paul leaned against the counter, and the camera turned back to a bubbly young woman and a middle-aged man dressed in a similar gray suit. "For those of you just joining us, our top story remains the murder of the mayor and his wife early this morning. Police responded to screams in the early morning hours and found both victims stabbed multiple times. Though the murder weapon, like much else about the murder, has not been released, police have said that they have a suspect in custody. Pretty unsettling stuff, wouldn't you say, Megan?" The bubbly brown-haired woman on his side nodded fervently. "Unsettling indeed. The murders come just a week after the mayor's inflammatory remarks concerning the rights of ID workers after their second week on strike. He was a firm opponent of artificial rights in—" But Paul turned it off and put the empty bowl in the sink. The news was so depressing these days. People being murdered in their own homes. These damn ID workers thinking they could demand rights all of a sudden. And to top it all off, there was so much anti-ID sentiment that the city was becoming a melting pot of chaos. "At least I've got my Lisa." The struggles of the world don't mean much as long as I've got her, he said to himself. Paul beamed all the way to work. He passed other people on the street, making their way to work, home, or wherever they were going this time of morning. He didn't care. He was on cloud 9. He just really didn't have time to pay any more attention. He had a checklist of things he needed to get done today, and as he rounded 8th Street and proceeded to Wellington, he ticked them off. He had a meeting at 1 to prepare for. He'd be introducing his product findings for the quarter. Then at 3, he had his next quarter numbers to send to the boss. Then it was home to spend his evenings in the virtual embrace of Lisa. Somewhere along the way, he'd see his friends, have lunch, pick up dinner, but that too seemed secondary next to the idea of talking to Lisa. He sighed, wishing it were 3 already. There was a big crowd outside when he arrived, and he could see police tape across the doors. Mr. Marshall, the office director, was talking loudly to a uniformed man, and several officers were carrying out computers, taking fingerprints, removing fragments from the door. Paul slid in next to Frank. As usual, Reagan was late, but it didn't look like anyone would be getting any work done today. "What happened?" Paul asked in a hushed voice, as one of the officers brought a filing cabinet out on a hand dolly. "Seems there was a break-in last night," said Frank, making no effort to keep his voice low. "A break-in? What could anybody possibly want in our office? I mean, we sell computer chips. We don't even keep them on site." "No clue," said Frank, as Reagan slid in next to him. A blonde woman, Paul thought her name was Frances, leaned back and said in a low voice, "Agnes was the first person in this morning. She said the front door to the Human Resource Office was destroyed, and 2 filing cabinets were wrenched open. She thinks they were after files or something." Paul's brow creased as he contemplated the mystery that had suddenly and possibly led to him not having to work today. He smiled a little to himself, thinking that sounded like a pretty good day to him. "And so they gave us the rest of the day off, and tomorrow, with pay. That's wonderful, Polly. I'm glad you got some time to rest after such a stressful week." They had been talking all morning. As lunchtime came around, Paul's stomach made a low, pitiful rumble. He ignored it, though. This was right where he wanted to be. As it rumbled again, though, an idea began to form. "Stomach's trying to tear me away from you," he commented offhandedly. "Oh, do you need to get some lunch?" "Well, actually, I was hoping you'd maybe meet me somewhere. Maybe Gabriel's on 7th? They make a mean hoagie." The message hung for a couple of minutes. "My treat," he added, not liking the silence. I don't know, Polly," she finally said after a few more seconds of silence. "Lisa, if I'm being honest, I like you, and I would like to take our relationship to a more 3-dimensional level. Won't you please consider a date with me?" She hesitated before responding. "I'm sorry, Polly. I'm just not ready yet. There are things about myself I'm not quite comfortable with. I can't face you. Not yet, Polly. Just be patient with me. I'm new to this kind of thing." Polly sighed. "You're a girl worth waiting for, Lisa. A girl as pretty as you can take their time." "Oh, Polly, you always know just what to say to make a girl smile." "So, Paul, how's that lady of yours?" Paul kept his eyes on his computer. This document had to be finished before he left at 3. The break-in had been a week ago, but the office was still trying to get back into their usual routine. "Fine," he said, returning to typing. "So, when's the first date?" Frank asked as he stirred lazily at his coffee. He'd been getting pretty nosy after the break-in, and his questions were becoming suffocating. Between Frank and Reagan, he was lucky to get a moment's peace. They were continuously asking him out for drinks or to stop by unannounced to hang out, which seemed to entail keeping him off the computer and squarely in the real world. He was already irritable from a lack of sleep, and he really didn't need this today. He couldn't say why, but he was sure someone had been on the fire escape last night. He'd woken up several times to a shadow cast across his bed and the foreboding feeling of being watched. The shadow would move as soon as he tried to see what it was, until finally he'd slept facing away from the window and hadn't been bothered for the rest of the night. His conversations with Lisa had gotten more involved as well, to his great joy. The intimacy of the questions often made him blush, and she seemed ravenous to know everything about him. The minutest details seemed to only stoke the flames of her curiosity, and Paul felt giddy as she shared more of herself with him. Meetings, however, remained a shaky bit of ground. "We haven't set one," he said curtly, as he continued about his business. It was getting late, nearly 3, and his work wasn't done. He'd have to stay late to finish, and that was precious time that he couldn't spend with Lisa. "Geez, Paul, you've been talking to this gal for a month now, and you still haven't met her?" "I don't recall asking your opinion on my relationship, Frank," Paul snapped, and instantly felt ashamed. "Sorry. I'm just tired. I didn't sleep well last night again." He didn't dare tell anyone about the shadow. People would think he was nuts. "It's fine, buddy. I can tell you're hurting for sleep. I just don't want to see you get burned, you know? These gals online find a nice guy like you, and they bleed him dry, Paul. Can we change the subject?" Paul begged. Frank nodded, taking the hint. "You hear about the disappearance of that scientist from the facility?" Of course Paul had. It was all over the news. They think now that the ID might have been involved. You know, our company had something to do with them in the first place. So maybe they think we need a little revenge on our own." Paul was about to say this really wasn't a topic for work when the clock struck 3, and Paul happily filed his report away and turned his computer off for the night. "Another fun-filled evening with your make-believe lady?" Frank asked, and Paul pulled his windbreaker on over his work shirt. "Lisa's a real person, Frank. I wish you could see her the way I do sometimes. Then maybe you'd stop with all these stupid questions." Frank scoffed. "Make sure you get some sleep, buddy. You look kind of beat." "Thanks, Mom," Paul said, as he threw his messenger bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. As he neared his apartment, Paul saw an unfamiliar woman near the mailboxes. She was bent at the knee, reading the names on the mailboxes through squinted eyes. Her long brown hair tumbled down her back, and she was dressed simply in a green t-shirt and cut-off jeans. She was gorgeous by anyone's standards, and she was receiving a good number of stares from the passers-by. Paul realized with embarrassment that he was one of them. He shook himself out of his daze. Lisa would be waiting for him. As he walked towards the door, though, the woman straightened suddenly and looked at him oddly. "Polly?" she said excitedly. "Lisa?" The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. Subconsciously, he had known it was her, but he hadn't dared to hope it could be true. She hugged him briefly, and he returned the gesture. Her arms were certainly firm for someone so small, he thought, as she crushed him against her. She definitely wasn't as big a homebody as he'd thought, and he reflected that making her mad might be a bad idea. "It's so nice to finally meet you in person. I was worried when I couldn't find your name on the mailboxes." Paul could only look at her with astonishment. She was here. She was finally here. Her hands were in his. Her voice was like honey poured over a sonnet. Her hair tumbled easily down the back of her neck in warm, thick sheets. Her eyes seemed to smile at him from under her bangs. She was a vision, a goddess. Paul could feel the blood pumping in his ears as she spoke. The edges of his world were blurring. "Paul, is everything okay?" He sighed, clearing the butterflies from his stomach. "I'm just so surprised you're here." She smiled and placed a delicate finger to her cheek, crooking the other under her chin. "Is it a good surprise?" she asked coyly. He grinned. "The best." "Are you sure I can't make you something to eat?" Paul had easily made enough pasta for 5 people, let alone 2. His attention had been elsewhere, on that perfect goddess that sat in his dining room. She seemed drawn to him, too, never looking away, never tiring of his face, as he stood there at the stove, cooking the only dish he knew. Bachelor life was tough, but spaghetti was easy. "Oh, no, it's fine. I already ate before I came," she said quickly. Paul spun his fork absent-mindedly as she continued to stare at him. He popped a roll of spaghetti in his mouth and gasped. It was hot. The noodles burned the roof of his mouth suddenly, and his hands groped for his wineglass. She giggled, and he took a long sip as he grimaced at the bitter taste of cheap wine. "Do I distract you that much?" she asked innocently. Paul grinned sheepishly. "Kind of a lot. I hate to think you had to walk all the way here just to see me. You should tell me next time, and I'll—" He remembered something then. "Well, I guess I won't be able to walk you here since I don't think you've ever told me where you live." "No, it's fine. I don't mind. Any excuse to see you, she purred as she dodged the question. They both blushed, and Paul took another bite of spaghetti. His heart was pounding. What was she doing here? Not that he wasn't pleased to see her after a month of conversations, but a woman like this could have any man she wanted. Why would she settle for a lowly cubicle jockey like me, he thought. So, did you find the place okay? He asked, hoping to break the silence. Oh, yeah. It was quite a nice walk. I'm jealous you get to see this every day to work. The stores are likely just opening when you head out, and I can only imagine what kind of smells and sounds you must hear. Paul took another bite and then another as she spoke. When had he told her where he worked? Or for that matter, where he lived? He tried to remember as she went on and on about the scenery, but he just couldn't remember. His face must have said more than he meant it to, because she looked at him and asked, "What are you thinking about so hard, Polly?" And then it was all gone. She laid her fingers across her cheek again and cocked her head just so, and he was putty in her hands. "Oh, nothing. I thought maybe we could watch a movie." "I hope you have something romantic," she said, with a little giggle. So she just showed up out of the blue. "That's right," Paul said, triumphant. He'd met Frank and Reagan for lunch at one of the sports bars near his apartment. They'd wanted to watch the Bears play, and neither was well stocked for food at their place. The sports bar was packed, likely more Bear fans, and the noise was deafening. It was so surreal. She just showed up, out of the blue, and stayed with me all night. He could feel his face turning red, but he couldn't let them see. "All night, huh?" Reagan said with a grin. Paul laughed. "Not like that. We just sort of sat around and enjoyed each other's company." "Uh-huh," said Reagan, unconvinced. Frank seemed thoughtful, though. "So she just showed up?" Paul looked at him. "Yeah. Funny. Thought you said she was nervous about meeting you." "I guess she got over it," Paul said with a shrug. "Funny how you never mentioned switching addresses with this mystery girl." Paul furrowed his brow. "That's right, yeah. Come to think of it, I didn't remember giving her my address. I suppose I must have forgotten, though. We've been talking for months. It was bound to come up." "And your work, too? Did that come up all of a sudden?" A chill ran down Paul's spine. "Now that you mention it, hey, what's with the third degree here, Frank? Doesn't strike you as odd that this girl just showed up out of the blue without being invited and without being told where you live or where you work? This is Chicago, Paul. Do you have any idea what the chances of meeting someone at a specific time and place with no clue where that place is are? 1 in a million, just like this girl," Paul chuckled. "Be serious, Paul. You may think this is endearing, but we have a word for people like that, and it's called stalker. You—" But he faltered as a shadow fell across the table. Paul looked up and into the wet, moss-colored eyes of his angel. Lisa was there, carrying a glass of beer and wearing a Bears jersey. She had obviously heard the conversation. Paul barely got her name out before she was running for the door of the crowded bar, beer crashing to the floor in a foamy wave. "Lisa, wait! Lisa!" Paul was on his feet and after her in a second. He pushed through the crowd of people, most cursing and shouting in his wake, but as he exited to the street, he found no trace of Lisa. "No," he sobbed, grabbing the building for support. She was gone. She'd run away from him, and now he'd never see her again. His stomach felt like he'd swallowed a hot brick. Tears came unbidden to his eyes. "Dude, I'm sorry," said Frank. I didn't mean to." Paul didn't remember slipping it to the ground, but Frank's hand was reaching for him, and he slapped it away angrily. "Next time, why don't you just keep your goddamn mouth shut?" he shouted as he lurched to his feet and began running for his apartment. Paul sighed as he walked home after another busy day at the office. It had been 5 days. 5 days since his fight with Frank. 5 days since he'd seen Lisa's tear-streaked face. She hadn't been online at all. No emails or visits either, and Paul was beginning to worry that he would never see her again. She had looked so upset at the bar, he wondered if she truly thought he believed Frank's suspicions. Frank. There was another mystery. No one had seen or heard from Frank since Saturday. He hadn't shown up to work all week, and Reagan said there was no answer at his apartment. As mad as Paul had been at Frank for his ill-timed outburst, he couldn't pretend he wasn't worried about him. They had been friends for years, and his disappearance was more than a little unsettling with all the ID intolerance going on. Paul sighed as his key scraped the lock. What was he going to do? He'd lost his best friend and the love of his life in one fell swoop. The red light was blinking on his machine when he got home, and when he pressed it, the voice he expected to hear wasn't there. Polly, it's Lisa. I know I have a lot to answer for, but I was wondering if you'd like to come over so I can try to explain what's been going on. Her address followed, along with some directions. Paul listened to the message 4 times, drinking in the sound of her voice, and there was hurt in it that almost brought Paul to tears. They made him feel guilty as he left his apartment and trekked the familiar path downtown. Lisa lived in a large brick building in one of the nicer parts of the city. He found her apartment easily, and when he knocked, a little voice told him to come in. As he entered, he couldn't help but notice the long red streak up the floor. Paul had never seen blood, but he'd seen enough cop dramas to know what the start of a crime scene looks like. A chill swept over him as he entered. She was sitting on the couch, a fire burning in the grate. She turned to look at him, and her angelic face was a welcome sight. As she spread her arms wide and ran to him, Paul was surprised that he didn't cringe away from her, especially since her hands were caked in blood. I'm so sorry, Paul. I'm sorry for everything, but it's okay now. No one will stop us from being together. Paul saw over her shoulder that the red streak led to the nearby bathroom, and the bottom fell out of his stomach. Lisa, what have you done? Her face clouded up, and tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. I had to, Paul. I had to kill him. He was suspicious of me. He'd been suspicious of me from the start. If he kept digging, he would find out I was the one who broke into your office, and Paul pushed her away gently but firmly. Wait, that was you? I was intrigued by you, Paul. I had to know more. I had to. I had to see you, hear you, know you without you seeing me. I had to be sure, Polly. I had to be sure I could trust you. Lisa, you're the one that's been coming to my window at night, aren't you? She looked away, ashamed. You stole my address, my phone number. You broke into my office just a what, Lisa? What did you hope to gain? She was crying again, and when she looked up at him, he could see her honesty as she answered, You, Paul? You're all I've ever wanted. You're all I ever hoped to gain. His blood ran cold. His breath came out in troubled gasps. He felt like someone was tearing his lungs out. How could this angel be so tainted? A criminal? A stalker? A killer? Why would you do this, Lisa? Why would you... But he stopped. She had taken his breath away again. Her hands had begun to deftly pull behind her hair, bringing her face away from it. Her perfect face had fallen away like a Halloween mask, and she had brushed away the stray strands that clung to her. As the fleshy roll hung from her neck, Paul could see a pill-shaped metal cylinder staring back at him through 2 yellow-tinted eyes. When she spoke, no mouth opened, but her voice was still Lisa's. Because I'm not human, Paul. Because there are people who don't think I deserve a normal life. Paul took a step back, horror spreading across his face. What are you? He breathed, his breath coming out in gasps, like someone had punched him in the stomach and never pulled their hand away. Why, Paul? Don't you remember? I'm Lisa, L model intimacy servo automaton, and I'm all yours, Polly.
Sometimes you just never know who you're talking to online. Coming up next, we have a story about an accountant that gets drawn into something a little bigger than he expected. So let's give a listen to Howard's song.
The smooth jazz buzzed through his ears as Howard finished correlating the numbers for his latest job. The Baxter account was coming along nicely. Howard felt quite sure that he would have the account books done before quitting time. It had been a hard job. Mr. Baxter had not kept good records, but he had finally chased down all those loose ends, and... Howard cocked his head like a dog that's heard a sound he can't quite place. Had someone been calling him? The smooth jazz he always listened to when he worked was devoid of words. Words tended to distract him while he was working. He shook his head and got back to it. The account was nearly done, and he had a meeting in an hour to finalize it. He'd give his boss something to crow about this time. Charles Baxter was a very wealthy man, and his business would do wonders for the company. Howard bet his boss would give him a bonus after seeing all the excellent work he'd... Howard! Howard turned to look behind him. Someone had said his name, almost spoken it in his ear. As he looked around, he was perplexed as to where it was coming from. Looking back to the computer, he began to type again. His nerves were a little rattled at the thought of a disembodied voice and... Howard! Howard jumped and nearly overturned his chair. Someone had shouted his name, screamed it right into his ear. Even now, as he looked around his home office, he could see no one. Howard lived alone with no wife or children or roommates to distract him, and the thought of someone in his house made him very upset. This was his home, his place of refuge, and as he started to rise from his chair, he resigned himself to search the whole house until whoever was here was found. He had just opened the closet when the voice spoke again. "Sorry to startle you, Howard. Now that I've got your attention, I need to talk to you." Howard stared dumbly into the closet. The old jackets and blue storage bins did not begin to speak to him. No one sprang from concealment either to admit to the disturbance, and he came to realize that the voice was not coming from the house. The voice was not an intruder, or a disembodied ghost voice, of which he did not believe in. The voice seemed to be coming from his earbuds. The voice was that of an average, everyday person. Howard could have sat next to him on the bus, or chatted with him in line for his morning bagel. The voice was smooth, educated, and not too terribly unlike his own. This made Howard feel a little easier, a little calmer. As he stood looking into the coat closet, he felt less worried about home invaders, and more concerned about why someone in his earbuds knew his name. "Wonderful! Now that I have your attention, I need you to leave the house." That struck Howard as odd. Not that anything in this situation was expected, but leaving the house? Howard worked mostly from home, always had after his employer had determined that it was better for his productivity. As such, he had maintained a rigorous schedule. He really only left the house to get groceries once a week, and to visit a certain woman he liked. Their relationship was based on cash exchange only, of course, but he still had a schedule, and he liked to stick to it. You are in great danger, Howard. Men are coming to hurt you, men who don't want you to finish this account, and if you're still here when they arrive, I fear you won't live to see tomorrow. This filled Howard with unease. Who was coming to hurt him? Why did they care so much about the Baxter account? I know this must be very upsetting to you, Howard, but I need you to do exactly as I say, so we can get you out of this troublesome situation. Take all the relevant information you have on the account and put it into your briefcase. Take the hard drive out of your computer, the silver box on the second tray, and put it in there as well. You can just yank it right out. It should come free. I need you to do all of this in the next 5 minutes and be at the bus stop before 2 o'clock. Go on. Get started now. Howard felt himself hesitating. Who was this voice? Why was he talking to him? How did he know that this wasn't some trick to get him to screw up all the data on his computer? Still, years of being an accountant drone meant that he had already begun to scoop the papers into his briefcase, even as he thought things over. He was used to following orders, and really, this was just one more in a long line of orders. The side of his desktop came off easily. He had saved his documents, of course, and powered it off. Now he had the case open, though, and the nagging voice asked again if he thought he was doing the right thing. This was crazy. He was going to yank a piece out of his computer just because a voice in his earbuds told him to. How did he know he wasn't being fooled? How did he know he wasn't having a mental breakdown? For all he knew, he had created the voice, which hadn't spoken in about a minute, and now he was getting ready to break his computer. Quickly now, Howard. They're on their way, the voice said, not showing the slightest bit of interest one way or another. Howard reached in, feeling the heat from the components, and gripped the hard drive. He lifted it out of the cradle, but instead of yanking, he detached the cables and easily brought the box out. He looked at it as it ticked and cooled and put it in his briefcase. He closed the case, grabbed his hat from beside the door, and left his house. Don't bother locking up. You probably won't be back, said the voice in that who cares sort of way. Now, walk down to the bus stop and sit with the wall blocking your view of the house. Why wouldn't I come back to my house, Howard thought, but he moved to the bus station without really thinking. He was running on autopilot as he came to the bus station and just sat down. The longer he sat, the longer the voice remained silent, the more he doubted that it would come again. A woman with a bratty kid sat next to him, and he clutched his briefcase on his lap. The kid looked up from his gadget, a box that was spewing noise at an ear-splitting level, to tell his mom that he wanted McDonald's when they got wherever they were going. She just patted him and said she would. The kid turned his grubby face back to the gadget then, and gave no more thought to the conscious world whatsoever. That was when Howard saw the car. The black town car drove right past the bus station and into his driveway. 4 men in black suits climbed out and walked towards his door. One of them knocked, 3 loud clumps, and they all waited for 30 seconds in a state of impatient tension. They all had sunglasses on and shiny black shoes. Howard thought they looked like government agents in a spy movie. As he peeked around the bus station wall, he saw one of them drive that shoe right into the door after receiving no answer. As they filed in, he thought he saw them reach into their coats for something. But the voice came back just as a big silver bus pulled up in front of the stop. "Never mind that, Howard. It's not your concern anymore. Just get on and take the bus to the number 12 stop. You can do that, can't you?" As Howard flashed his bus pass and took his seat, he found that he could. He rode the bus for the better part of an hour. He kept a firm hand on his briefcase, and as he rode, his eyes kept sweeping around to look at the other riders. The bratty boy and his doting mother were a few seats away. The kid hadn't looked up from his gadget since he'd spoken to his mother, and she seemed to be busy watching the world go by. An older woman was sitting up near the front with the driver. Her clothes made him think that she might be homeless, and a young man with headphones on was sleeping near the back of the bus. The flashing sign near the front said that they were nearing stop number 4. If the stops were in some kind of order, it would be 8 more stops before it was his turn to get off. He glanced out the window as they drove, the bus stopping occasionally, but rarely picking anyone up. The voice in his earbuds hadn't spoken for a while. He was again beginning to wonder if he'd made the whole thing up. Here he was, on a bus, with his work and his hard drive in a briefcase like some kind of spy. Maybe he had been working too hard. Maybe his boss was right, and he really did need to take some time off. "I don't want to alarm you, Howard, but it seems that the men in the town car are following you." Howard bristled. He turned his head slightly and could see the black town car in traffic behind the bus. The windows were polarized, so they couldn't see in, but they certainly knew where he was. It would be easy to find out if he had come onto this bus. He didn't exactly blend in, and then what would they do? Would they gun him down on the bus in front of all these people? Would they arrest him? Why were they after him? "I need you to get off at the next stop, Howard. Don't hesitate. Don't look around. Just step off the bus and take the alley to your left." Howard pulled the handle over his head, and when the bus stopped, he calmly walked out onto the busy sidewalk. The doors closed, and the bus rolled on into traffic. Behind it, the town car followed, being none the wiser that Howard had gotten off. He scanned the crowd and found the alley to his left. He took it, clutching the briefcase as he walked along the garbage cans. He didn't see anyone lingering around, and as he came out onto the other side of the busy street, he began to relax a little. There were no black town cars waiting for him, and that gave him some small amount of reassurance. "Now, cross the street and take the next alley to the number 12 stop. There will be a taxi waiting for you there. Take it to your destination." Howard glanced around, unsure until he finally saw the alley. It sat between an Italian restaurant and a computer repair store. Howard could see the large green dumpster that took up most of the lane, and knew it would be a squeeze to get around it. He started across the busy street, and was met by the sounds of horns honking and people cursing. He hurried across like a frightened rabbit, and made the alley before the screeching tires had stopped. The alley was awash with graffiti and the old smells of pasta. Someone had hung some band poster on the wall, but it did little to add to the place's charm. The dumpster was a stinking edifice of green and chrome. Howard was no dainty flower, but he shimmied around it with very little problem. He winced when his stomach rubbed against the filthy dumpster, but he was clear a moment later, and nearly out of the alley. "Stop," the voice said, and suddenly Howard was against the wall. He made himself as small as he could, and saw the black town car pull up next to the bus stop. "Don't move. Just be still, and they won't see you," said the oily voice in his ear. The man who had kicked in his door stepped out of the car. He bulged in his suit, a mountain of muscles, and Howard had little trouble believing that that man so easily booted in his door. He stepped out and walked to the bus stop. The bus Howard had departed, pulling up and offloading the few passengers. He looked hard at the mother and the brat, the child sticking his tongue out at him, and at the old lady who shuffled up the street. The bull stepped onto the bus and looked around, exchanging words with the driver before climbing off. He and the man in a taxi had another conversation, his town car blocking the sidewalk, which ended with the taxi honking and cursing and speeding away. The town car left a few seconds later, and Howard breathed a sigh of relief. A new taxi pulled up a minute later, and the driver asked Howard if his name was Howard Kernst. Howard climbed in, and they pulled into traffic. They drove until they hit the city limits. Howard had expected to go uptown to one of the glass edifices that marked the government buildings or the high-scale holdings. He had expected to be greeted by a man in a suit who would tell him that he had done well and explain all this. Instead, they drove into the desert. The driver didn't speak, he just drove. Howard was becoming nervous. The men in the town car had been one thing, but what if the man in the earpiece was worse? He tested the door and found that it was locked. He checked the windows and found that they wouldn't open. He tapped on the glass, but the man behind the wheel ignored him. "Patience, Howard," the man soothed. "All your questions will be answered soon." Howard settled a little, but as they drove deeper into the desert, he began to wonder what was happening. Howard was just an accountant, a great accountant, but still an accountant. Things like this didn't happen when you were just an accountant. You might get a paper cut or stub your toe on an average day, but certainly not get yourself involved in clandestine conspiracies or life or death struggles. Hell, the files he had from the Baxter account weren't even that interesting. Baxter owed a lot of money to the government, had a lot of back taxes, but Howard had managed to clear that up. His orders had been to make the problem go away, and he had. When the car stopped, Howard was jerked out of his contemplation. They had stopped outside a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere. Howard must have been wool gathering for longer than he thought because the sun was dipping low in the sky behind said station, and the afternoon was beginning to sink into evening. A sensible black sedan was parked in front of the gas station, and as they approached, a man opened the door for Howard and ushered him out. The man was wearing a black suit, much like Howard's pursuers, and his sunglasses reflected Howard's scared face back at him as he climbed from the taxi. The taxi driver accepted an envelope from the man, neither speaking a word, and the cab pulled away, leaving Howard and the man standing in front of this rundown gas station. "Right this way, Mr. Kernst," said the man, and the two walked towards the station. It was a tatty thing, gas pumps gone all brown and flaky, the glass crashed out in the windows, a single spindle rack spinning sluggishly in the wind, with a single bloated magazine on it. Howard had seen 1,000 of them in his time, utterly forgettable, and he feared to die in a place like this and become as forgotten as the old station. The thought was sudden, but he couldn't get it loose as soon as he had thought it. He was like a dog who's finally caught his tail and now can't let it go again. Howard was suddenly sure that this would be the place he died. The two walked around the back of the station, and there was a man in a folding chair, a beach umbrella covering him from the sun. He was dressed in a white suit, little blue piping roaming up the jacket. He had a fat, jolly face, hair the color of snow, and a pair of sunglasses with some reflective lenses Howard had become used to seeing. He smiled when he saw Howard, and the smile was genuine and warm. He pulled an earpiece out as they approached, and spread his pudgy arms wide as though to hug him. "At last, Mr. Kernst, at last you've arrived. May I call you Howard? It seems silly to rest on formalities after we've been through so much." Howard didn't trust him from the instant he opened his mouth until the end of his life. The man had a showy way of speaking, like a carnival barker or a snake oil salesman. He was the kind of man who turned everything into a Shakespearean presentation. He thought himself a showman, but really, he was just dramatic for the sake of drama. Howard hated people like that. The man seemed to pick up on some of his distaste. "I imagine you have 12 questions, maybe 24, and I want to answer them all, but I fear we don't have time. The biggest question I assume you have is why these men are chasing you, yes?" Howard nodded a little sullenly. "Well, the answer is quite simple. The men are, of course, my own." "Yours?" Howard asked, perplexed. "Of course. You see, if you had something I wanted, and there was no sense of urgency, you might start to ask questions. You might question the voice that suddenly popped into your head. You might not have come all this way into the desert on my order if I hadn't made the stakes a little high for you." He pulled a cigarette out of a silver case he had in his jacket, and Howard flinched when he saw the case come free. For half a second, he had seen a small silver handgun come out of that jacket, and he knew his life was about to end. The man flipped the case closed, but offered it to Howard before he put it away. Howard declined, and the man slid it back into his pocket with the same disappointment. The man who had escorted him from the taxi stepped close, flicking an expensive lighter and holding it to the end of the cigarette. Howard considered running into the desert while he was occupied. Catching a bullet in the back, however, did not seem much better than dying right here. "Now then, I imagine you'd like to know why I went to all this trouble to get the papers you have in your briefcase. Well, that's a little more complicated. You see, Charles Baxter has made some very important people very angry. He's made enemies out of the kind of men who don't really get mad. They get even. And in 22 hours, he will cease to exist forever. He will be erased from life, erased from memory, and erased from time." Howard gaped. Who was this guy? How exactly did you go about erasing someone from time? Charles Baxter was a fat cat around here, probably one of the most prominent businessmen in 3 states, but surely he was small potatoes in the grand scheme of things, right? So, as you can see, it's very inopportune for you to have files that prove this man existed at all. Charles Baxter is already dead. His associates are, as we speak, being ferreted out. You, Howard, are the last loose end we need to tie up. But why kill me just for having this information?" The man shrugged noncommittally. "Because it's easier than having you reprogrammed. At the end of the day, you're an unmarried accountant whose absence will go unremarked. You have no family, no real friends, not even any pets to mark their bowl's emptiness. You've lived an unremarkable life, Howard. Your death will be much the same." He threw the cigarette into the sand, half smoked, and held his hands out towards Howard. "Now then, the case, please." It was said nice enough, but Howard knew that it wasn't a request. The man was used to giving orders and having them followed, and for a moment, Howard thought about refusing him. He would die here, he knew that, but maybe he could die with some dignity. Perhaps he could die having fought against something that didn't seem right. He held onto the case for a few seconds, not sure what he meant to do with it, but in the end, he found himself handing the case to the man under the umbrella. At the end of the day, he was just an accountant after all. The man accepted the case, smiling, and this time the hand that came out of the suit coat did contain a small silver handgun. "Thank you, Howard. You've been very helpful." The gun went off, and Harold felt the slug enter his body. It burned for a few seconds, then he felt nothing. Howard's life ended in much the same way he had lived it, without much fuss.
You just never know what sort of folks you're going to find out in the middle of the desert digging holes. Coming up next, we have a story about a woman that just wants to experience a little vacation for once in a good long time. But what she finds may be a little more extended than she at first thought it would be. So let's hear a story about a getaway.
Liz couldn't really say she didn't know why she was here, but she could question why. Why a wise and just God would leave her here was beyond her, and if this was his plan, she wasn't sure of his wisdom. She could see him standing in the shadow of the palm trees, eyes red like a dog caught in the flash of a camera. All it did was stare, but she felt as if it wasn't all it intended to do. The trip had been one they'd planned for years, a girls' trip to the Bahamas, just her and her old sorority sisters, on a cruise for 5 sun-soaked days. Liz had been looking forward to it. It'd be nice to get out of the house for a while. Her BA in administration had mostly made a great dust catcher in the last 8 years since her graduation. Between the kids, the house, and her husband, and her call center job that she did to bring in a little spending money, she had little time for anything else. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Liz had contented herself with talking with her old sorority sisters, Janet, Claudia, and Maria, about their lives and what they'd all been up to. Janet wrote for a food blog, she and her husband jet-setting around as he ran his export business, and Liz loved to hear about all the foreign places she found herself in. Claudia was a lawyer, always the brains of the bunch, and Liz often celebrated with her over the computer about her courtroom victories. Maria was a designer in New York, and Liz would be lying if she didn't admit that she grudgingly lived vicariously through her bestie. Maria lived like one of the girls on Sex and the City, with a constant diet of different men, different gigs, and different problems that seemed to fix themselves before they got out of hand. Liz's life, in contrast, was pretty mundane. Her friends gushed appreciatively over the pictures of her kids, none of them having any, but it was clear that their admiration was mostly lip service. They were out living spectacular lives, while Liz was stuck in the gilded cage with her eggs. She was comfortable. Harold was a good man who took care of the bills and gave her whatever she wanted. She loved her kids dearly, but watching her friends as they went about their lives made her feel like hers was going nowhere. As she sat beside the fire, alone and watching the red-eyed creature, she now wished that she had stayed in her comfortable rut. When she had told Harold about the trip, his only real concern had been who would watch the kids. Harold was a dutiful husband, but he reminded her of an old song her mother had liked. She couldn't remember the name, but her mother had played it on cassette as she cleaned the house. Harold reminded her of a line from the song, one her mother always sang in tones of deepest disgust, a line that embodied Harold as much as it embodied her own father. "I'll raise the children while you go have a beer. Where is my John Wayne? Where is his shining gun? Where's my lonely ranger? Where have all the cowboys gone?" It was a good line. It had encompassed her life so well. Harold was not the owner of an export business. He wasn't a model or a defense attorney who might be moved to sleep with her after a trial. Harold was an assistant manager in a company that made oil drilling equipment. He was nice enough. He was stable. But his interest in her had clearly waned. It had happened some time after their second child. She saw his eyes began to wonder, and if he wasn't already having an affair, that his impending midlife crisis would surely drive him into one. She had assured him that her sister would watch the kids while he was at work, but that he might have to miss his after-work bar trips this week. "I'm sure she'll watch them on Saturday, though, so you can meet your associates at the links for your golf game." In retrospect, she thought he might have been a little too glad to hear how her sister, 19 and home from college, would be coming to sit with the kids. But that might just be in her head. The news that he could still golf on the weekends had softened his mood a bit. He even slipped her a few extra hundreds so she could fly to Orlando instead of driving. The idea that she might be stuck in traffic and miss her cruise was comforting now. But as she thought about the reunion with her friends, it brought a smile to her cracked lips. They had all met at the airport. First Liz and Maria, with Janet and Claudia flying in an hour later. The four had gone to dinner, drinking and talking about what they'd been doing, and finally boarded the boat at nightfall. They'd had a grand send-off with fireworks and champagne, and the four of them had talked excitedly about what they would do once they arrived in the Bahamas. "Hope your husbands gave you a day pass, ladies," Maria joked with Janet and Liz, "'cause you never know who you might meet on this trip." As Liz stared at the man-shaped thing, its unblinking eyes focused on her like twin beams. She wasn't sure that this was the someone that Maria had meant. It had all been smooth sailing until the second night. The four of them had drank at the bar, dined in the main hall, watched a few of the floor shows, and gone to bed thoroughly pleased. Maria had come in a little later, after leaving with a fella from the bar, and Liz wondered if she might pick up a fling of her own. She had turned red at the thought. Did she dare do such a thing? She didn't think she could, but who knew what a trip might bring? The second day had been spent around the pool. Liz was a little more self-conscious than the other three. She'd never quite gotten her figure back after her second child, but that didn't stop the eyes from finding her. They soaked up the sun, pretending to ignore the ogling eyes of those who looked, and Liz felt desired in a way that she hadn't since college. Harold did his duty at least once a week, but she'd come to suspect that that was out of habit. The men who looked at her and her friends seemed willing to do far more than their duty, and the thought made her smile as she watched them from behind her sunglasses. They had dressed in their best that night, their reservations at the captain's table being semi-formal, and Liz thought she might find herself in someone else's bed besides her own later. She was feeling confident in a way that she hadn't since she had met Harold, and as they laughed over drinks and appetizers, She wished the night would never end. When the ship stopped suddenly, groaning as if it had hit something, and lurching like a wild animal, she hoped she was asleep in her bunk still, her afternoon nap still ongoing. Now she knew better. As she felt her eyes getting heavy and heard the strange singing that had marked every evening after the first, she knew that the nightmare never ended. They started to evacuate soon after the sudden stop. The ship had run up against something, and it had shredded the side. Liz and her friends were shoved into a lifeboat with about a dozen others. They bobbed out into the night as the boat rode low in the water, its guts filling with the balmy island sea. Liz reflected that at least there had been enough boats for everyone, as the crewmen rowed them towards a collection of islands nearby. As Liz sat beside her friends, the adrenaline starting to ebb and the ocean rocking her amidst the warm bodies, she felt herself starting to drift off. You'd have said that such a thing was impossible, but she could hear others yawning and one particularly loud snorer behind her. She leaned her head against Maria and felt the other woman breathing heavily. It appeared Liz wasn't the only one getting tired, and as she drifted off, she thought she heard the first snatches of a song that would become very familiar. When she woke up, she found herself alone, the boat beached as the surf pushed it in and out amongst the sand of some unknown island. Liz had no idea how long she had been there, but the fact that she was alone filled her with a palpable dread. Where had everyone gone? Was she the only one left out of the 20 or so people in the boat? She got up, but immediately sat down as her sleeping legs refused to hold her. She tried to rub some of the feeling back into them, her hands as numb as her legs, and that was when she noticed the thing around her finger. It was a ring, woven from coconut fibers, and she couldn't remember seeing anything like it before. Where had it come from, and who had put it on her? It was tight on her finger, but Liz couldn't call it uncomfortable. It sat flush against her skin, and as she lifted it up to take a better look, she saw the creature for the first time. The island swam with fog, the trees and sand leading her to believe that it must be tropical. She had seen him in the mist, leaning against a palm tree as he stared at her. The two locked eyes, and she felt her skin crawl as he stared silently. It was as if they were the only two in existence, and the longer it went on, the less human he began to look. His arms became less human as they thickened and waxed and waned. Its legs appeared to double, then triple, and its head bulged oddly before returning to its normal dimensions. It was man-shaped, but certainly no man. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but when it turned its head suddenly, the spell was broken. She heard Maria calling her through the fog, and when she turned back to look, it was gone. "Glad you're finally awake," Maria said. "We got a little worried when you wouldn't wake up." How long was I out for?" Liz asked, getting shakily to her feet as the pins began to recede. "Nearly a whole day. We left 3 others out here with you. Did all of you wake up at the same time?" Liz shook her head as Maria took her arm and led her up the beach through the fog. "We've been trying to make something that will get the attention of ships or planes, but the fog is so thick I'm not sure anyone will see us. The rest of us have been trying to get some shelters up, but it's hard to find materials and all this." As they came through the fog, Liz could see that there were around 15 others milling about. Men, women, even a couple of kids went about their tasks without much enthusiasm. They looked at Liz disinterestedly as she and Maria approached, and Liz saw Janet and Claudia as they turned rocks into words so a plane might see them. They both waved as they walked over to them. The rest of the day was spent raising lean-tos and setting up fire pits. She met some of the others, her fellow castaways, and they seemed to have quite a mixed bag. There was Ben and his sister Catherine, Angela and her daughter Celeste, Margot, Roger, his boyfriend Francis, Tracy, who carried around a typewriter case with a manuscript inside, Gail, Kathy, and her son Gregory. They feasted on nuts and fruit, coconuts, and some little crabs that Ben and Francis had managed to scare up around dusk, and as they ate, the group discussed what they would do tomorrow. "It might be nice to take stock of the island," Ben said. "Find out if there are any others here." "A source of fresh water might be good, too," Maria put in, and Liz couldn't help but notice that she kept looking shyly at the older man as he agreed. Liz tried to keep up, but it was hard to focus on planning. It's hard to focus on anything with the pair of red eyes that stared at her from the nearby palm tree. No one else seemed to have noticed it, and the longer it stared, the more she realized that it was staring only at her. Whatever the creature was, it seemed to have eyes only for Liz, though the attention was far from flattering. Her finger itched, and Liz realized that it was the first time she had thought about the ring in a while. She wondered if it had been given to her while she slept. Why not just take her too, if it had gotten that close? As the others began to get comfortable, Liz watched the creature in the fog as it stood its lonely vigil, which was why she was still awake when the singing began. Liz didn't know where it came from, or whether it had anything to do with the mysterious voyeur, but she blinked a little too long and found the red eyes had gone when she was awake. She sat blinking, the sounds of snoring vibrating around her. The night was suddenly split by a heavy baritone. It rolled across the sleeping people, hitting Liz like the warm steam off a cup of tea. As she watched, a few of her fellow survivors staggered up, getting to their feet and walking towards the jungle. They moved like sleepwalkers, their legs taking them shakily into the fog. In the dark, Liz wasn't certain who it had been, but in the morning, there were two less than there had been the day before. She hadn't slept that night, but as the sun came up and turned the fog into a blanket of diamonds, she pretended to. The last thing she wanted was to answer questions about missing people. No one seemed to notice at first, but by noon the disappearance of two people was hard to ignore. "Any idea where Roger and Francis are?" Catherine asked, looking around like she might have just missed them. "Off doing God knows what, I'm sure," Ben muttered, drawing some dark looks from a few of the others. He had made his displeasure at the pair of them pretty clear to everyone but them, and didn't seem to care about their disappearance too much. A couple of people talked about going to look for them, but it was finally decided that if they had gone off on their own, then they would either come back or they wouldn't. People went about their day, some looking for food, others trying to find planes or boats to hail. As the day spun out, Liz wondered if she should tell someone what she had seen the night before. She hadn't told anyone about the man-shaped thing in the jungle, and if it was the same thing taking people, maybe they needed to know. Her thoughts chased her throughout the day, but as the sun set and the fire cast sparks into the night sky, Liz found herself awake and searching for the creature. She hadn't have far to look. It had been there since dusk, just watching her as she sat by the fire. The fog was still a thick pea soup, and the image within it swelled and distorted as she kept an eye on it. Her head dipped and jittered as she tried to stay awake, but when the singing began tonight, it was like a sweet lullaby. She saw three shapes rise around her, the fire turning them into silhouettes against the sparks, and as they stumbled away from the dancing flame, she tried to call out to them, to raise some kind of an alarm. She was fading away as the deep, resonant voice drowned her amidst the crashing waves of the beach, however, and soon she found herself asleep. The camp awoke to find they were 10 now, and Liz discovered that one of the shades had been Claudia. Another had been Angela's daughter, and she was beside herself with grief. "Has anyone seen Celeste? She was right here next to me when I fell asleep last night." "We should go look for them," Maria suggested, looking pleadingly at Liz and Janet as she tried to move the others to go with her. Most didn't seem keen on going off into the mist to hunt for people who'd disappeared, especially if there was something out there taking them. Liz found it impossible not to be moved by Maria's words, though, and Janet seemed to feel the same. Claudia was their friend, and Celeste was just a child. The thought of them lost and scared in a strange place made Liz's heart ache, and the three assured Angela that they would try their best to find her daughter. She thanked them tearfully. The disappearance had left her in a state of grief so deep that she could do little but sit and rock as she cried. In the end, the three set out to search for those who had disappeared, and the others watched them leave, with not much expectation that they would see them again. The foliage smooshed wetly underfoot as they searched, the fog a constant blanket around them. The palms gave way to thin pines and wispy spruces that seemed to grow small, round nuts. The ground was far too wet to see much. Any footprints that might have existed were obliterated by the soupy ground, and as the three women searched the jungle, they found no trace of the missing people. Liz was no tracker, but in the movies there were always signs left behind when someone went missing in the woods. Fabric left on a tree, hair hanging from a branch, maybe a swatch of blood smeared across the bark. But there was none of that here. It was as if the island had swallowed them up, leaving nothing behind to mark their passage from life to death. The whole time, Liz felt like she was being followed. She glanced fitfully around as she looked for the man-shaped thing. She caught the odd glance of something, some vague shape amidst the mist, but it was impossible to tell if it was her voyeur or not. She felt pursued, this thing dogging her heels wherever she went, and she began to wonder if it was the thing that had summoned them to the island. Were they all just lunch for this creature? A game of cat and mouse to break up the monotony of its existence? When the sun began to set, they were forced to head back to camp empty-handed and heavy-hearted. Angela was inconsolable. The group came together for her, but their eyes were more often than not on the jungle. The fires were stoked, and as people began to get comfortable for sleep, Liz found herself too tired to join them. She had collapsed after they'd returned from the search, exhausted from all that walking, and her sleep had been heavy and dreamless. That night, Liz finally got to meet her mysterious watcher, and it likely saved them from another loss. It was late when she jerked awake, unsure how long she'd been asleep. The fire was burning low now, the ashes flickering into the sky as the logs crumbled beneath the assault of the heat. Liz thought at first that the waves had woken her up, but as she glanced into the gathering shadow, she could see those red eyes as they bore into her. They were closer now, maybe 15 feet away, but Liz was finding it harder and harder to be terrified of her mysterious watcher. The longer she sat looking at those red eyes, the more curious Liz found herself. "Hello?" she asked, keeping her voice low so as not to wake anyone up. The red eyes blinked, unsure, but when a voice answered her, it was very different from the deep baritone she'd heard singing at night. "Hello," it answered, its voice unsure as its features remained unknowable from behind the thick fog. Do you live here?" Liz asked, feeling foolish almost at once. It had been here since before they got here. Of course it lived here. "Yes, for most of my life, I think." The two talked for a bit, Liz becoming more comfortable the longer it didn't simply leap on her and gobble her up. It confirmed her suspicions that the island wasn't boundless and that her group of survivors were the only people here. She asked about the fog, and it told her that it just always was here, but that it kept everything nice and cool, so it wasn't unwelcome. It would have amazed her how quickly she fell into a normal conversation with this creature if she hadn't been so absolutely exhausted. As it stood, it seemed like the most natural thing to have happened in a while. "Are you the one singing at night?" she asked after it finished telling her about the caves near the edge of the island. It was beginning to lighten on the horizon, and Liz realized that it might leave before she got some of her burning questions answered. The eyes had been crinkling a little as it spoke, clearly enjoying their talk, but as she asked about the song, they took a different downturn. Was it mistrust, or was he ashamed of the answer? "Yes, that's me," he answered, clearly hesitant. Are you the one—" "Liz?" someone said sleepily, and Liz turned to see Maria sitting up groggily. Who are you talking to?" Liz turned back to introduce Maria to the thing she'd been so comfortably chatting with, but it was gone. "No one. Must have been talking in my sleep," Liz answered. There were no new missing people in the morning, but it did little to help the tension. Ben had started talking about making spears or something to defend themselves, but most of the others were more concerned with surviving. Even so, the foragers took homemade spears he had made when they went to look for food. His sister Catherine tried to talk to him, telling him that he was making everyone anxious, but he loudly told her that everyone should be worried about whatever was taking people in the night. Angela looked like a ghost as she sat looking at the waves, and people seemed content to give her space. She was mourning the loss of her daughter, and it was unclear whether her tears were swelling the ocean or the ocean was rushing forward to give her its salt. Liz found herself thinking about the odd creature as she went about her day. It hadn't been like she had expected, and she found herself wondering if it had really been the one taking people. She still hadn't told anyone about it, and most of the others would have assumed that she was going crazy. The thought of those red eyes creeping up to talk to her in the night would have scared some of them and made others think that she was losing it. Worse yet, she suspected that Ben would stay up and try to fight it if she told him, so she kept her mysterious new friend to herself. For the next week, she would stay up after the fire burned low and meet with it. She didn't hear the singing on those nights, and the red eyes seemed more than happy to come back night after night so they could learn more about her. Whatever it was, it seemed very interested in Liz and the life she had lived on the mainland. They talked about boats and cars and television, the food she used to eat, the people she'd known, her family, anything else the creature could think of. Liz would find herself watching him as his body did strange things, thickening and shriveling, multiplying and dividing, and the longer she watched it, the less afraid she became. The longer they talked, the less substantial it seemed to become, and that worried her. Liz found that she was afraid of losing it, the thing that made her feel almost normal. The mist seemed to clutch at it, making its features even less recognizable, and it added a level of unreality to it. It made it seem as if it were fading away. "Can I tell you a secret?" it said suddenly, leaning in close one night and causing Liz to blink as the fog pattered against her face. "Sure," she said, glad for a break in conversation. Liz had been worried that she might run out of things to talk about, and then it would go away. She'd forgotten to be afraid of it, and was glad for the company and the attention this thing showed her after everyone else had gone to sleep. She missed her family and her children most of all, but having it here to talk to made it a little easier, a little more tolerable. "When you first noticed me, I had come to watch you." "Me?" Liz asked, surprised. "Why me?" "I noticed you when your boat came. You were just sitting there, sleeping, and I couldn't take my eyes off you. That's why I gave you the ring." Liz had been struggling with the conflicting nature of being both uncomfortable at the idea of this thing watching her and strangely flattered by its attention. When was the last time anyone had paid that sort of attention to her? Certainly not at home. Certainly not since she left college and started her descent into wedded bliss. She jumped a little when he mentioned the ring, having almost forgotten about it until right then. Sometimes she would go all day without thinking about it, and then it would suddenly catch on something, or the scratchy fibers would peel at her skin like steel wool, and she would remember that it was there. "You gave me the ring?" she asked, watching its head wobble oddly. "I did," and though it sounded like it wanted to say more, it was unsure how to proceed. "I don't know what to say," Liz said, knowing exactly what she wanted to say, but unsure if she could ask. The two sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the waves break on the beach as they stared at each other. "Why don't you ever sing any more?" Liz asked suddenly, causing the eyes to back up a little bit. They backed further away, getting closer to the tree line, but still unable to look away from Liz. Why don't you sing any more?" she asked again, and this time it sounded like an accusation. He was almost 30 feet away, but Liz still heard him when he whispered the secret he'd longed to keep hidden. "Because I don't want to hurt you, but I'm so hungry." As the sun came up, dispelling some of the fog, Liz was left with nothing but her confusion of mismatched feelings. Whatever he was, he managed to hold out for another 3 days. Liz didn't see him again until the third night, and that was when she heard the singing. Liz had thrown herself into any task she could find, trying to take her mind off of him. She wasn't exactly sure when he had gone from it to a him, but the transition made her wary. She'd been working to leave the island, wanting to return to the life she'd known, but now her tasks seemed so pointless. Maria had started lighting fires along the coast in an attempt to get the attention of a passing ship. Janet wanted to make a map of the island, something they could use to explore deeper for supplies. Ben wanted to find better shelter in case the weather changed. Gail wanted to try to find out if they could see the shipwreck at some point on the island, so they could get their bearings. Tracy just wanted to sit and work on her manuscript, and the others seemed content to just exist here until it was all over. It all seemed very trivial to Liz. Despite this, she threw herself into anything that came her way, whether it was scouring the island for resources, looking for somewhere to move the group, or just feeding fuel to the multiple signal fires. All the while, she could feel the eyes of her admirer as they followed her. She never saw him lurking in the mist, but she could sense his presence. He kept his distance, watching her from afar, and Liz was worried that she had offended him. She had suspected that he was the one luring people away, but she hadn't really understood the implication until he'd spelled them out for her. They would never find their fellow survivors, no matter how much they searched, and it was strange to feel so attached to someone who saw you as food. Angela had disappeared on the second day, but Liz doubted that her new friend had anything to do with it. Angela had done little else but weep for 2 days, the sea drinking her tears greedily. She wouldn't eat or drink, wouldn't come to camp no matter what the time, and when they woke up to find her stretch of beach had gone empty, Liz assumed that she had just wandered out into the sea. It might have been the kindest thing for her, but Ben had other ideas. With only 9 of them, Ben and Gail were now carrying clubs and accompanied anyone who left the camp to forage. They had appointed themselves as de facto guardians of the camp, and Ben seemed to have decided that he was their leader. He and Catherine argued often, but his patience for her seemed to be running thin. Kathy and Gregory had taken to sleeping close to Liz and her friends, and Kathy kept a protective arm around her son at all times. Tracy slept with her arms around her typewriter case, holding it like someone might a stuffed animal, but even she had moved closer to the group for protection. When Catherine came to join them on the 3rd night, they all slept in a shallow pile, like rabbits in a warren. Ben and Gail sat around the fire, blinking owlishly as they kept watch, but to Liz it began to feel more like a prison camp than a group of survivors. Liz woke up on the 3rd night to the sound of singing. She found herself looking for those piercing red eyes amongst the fog, and found his shadowy body not too far away. Dark forms imposed themselves across her vision, and she watched them lumber into the trees before realizing what had actually woken her. It was only Ben by the fire now, Gail having left to go with her mysterious admirer, but now only Tracy's battered typewriter case was left to mark that she had existed at all. Some of the others were beginning to squirm, but instead of lingering, the music began to fade almost at once, making a couple of them jerk quietly as they sat down. One of them had been Janet, all 3 of the women sleeping close enough to each other for some semblance of protection, and as Liz settled back in, she found herself feeling torn about the absence of her mysterious new friend. Ben was upset the next day, enraged by the loss of Gail, and the others stuck close to camp that day. A light rain had blown in, and they seemed content to fix the boat tarp they had taken off the lifeboat to keep the worst of the rain off the fire. They huddled underneath it, shivering as the storm pattered around them. Ben stayed up late, his sleep utterly forgotten, but Liz's visitor didn't come back that night. She supposed he was full after eating so well the night before, but Liz still found her own sleep difficult. She was exhausted, unsure how much longer she could do this, and as she drifted off, she wondered who would be missing in the morning. When Janet's hand slid out of hers, Liz sat up in time to watch her walk out into the rain. The singing was getting farther away already, and when she looked at Ben, she found that he was snoring in the sand after tumbling off the log he'd been sitting on. Liz went after her friend before she could think better of it, and the rain was cold on her face as she moved out into the darkness. It didn't seem to affect Janet at all, and as Liz pulled at her to get her attention, it was like pulling on a stone. She strained at her, looping her legs around her as she tried to trip her up, but Janet's eyes were set as she made her way into the woods. Janet pulled her into the jungle, the two still struggling, and Liz could see those red eyes burning into the depths of her from the woods. "Stop it!" she yelled, tears mingling with the rain and sliding down her face. "Don't take her! She's my friend!" There was silence in the jungle, broken only by the falling of the rain as it hit the thick fronds of the trees. It was almost too loud for her to hear when he spoke, but it was just loud enough to reach her as he slipped into the wet blackness of the surrounding jungle. "Sorry, it's my nature," said the scorpion to the frog. She was left to ponder that as the rain soaked her to the bone, leaving her confused and apprehensive. Maria wrapped Liz in a hug when she came back, the camp awake and holding torches. They had spears too, even Gregory, and Ben pressed one into Liz's hand as Maria let her go. His eyes mistrusted her, but were resolved. He was clearly suspicious of her, but with only 6 of them remaining, he was forced to put his misgivings aside. "We're going after it," he said. And as her eyes grew wide, Ben smiled knowingly. "That's right. I've seen it too. I saw it tonight as you tried to drag your friend back, and I've seen it lurking around the camp more than once. I'm still not sure it's the thing that's taken people, but at this point, I don't much care. We're gonna find it. We're gonna kill it before it kills us." Liz wanted to deny him, wanted to scream at him, wanted to stab the spear into him and make him shut up, but instead, she fell in with Maria and let him lead her into the semi-darkness. She felt claustrophobic as they made their way into the jungle. Ben had no clue where he was going, but as the sun rose over the horizon, he kept them moving as their torches burned low and their clothes clung to them. They had set out with bellies full of fire, determined to find this thing. They crisscrossed the island, the sun dispelling the shadows as they moved, but they never seemed to find anything that could make a good hiding spot for anything bigger than a bird or a badger. The longer they searched, the more frantic Ben seemed to become. "Where are you?" he kept whispering, looking around frantically as he stalked the groves. "It has to be here somewhere." His need to find the creature seemed insatiable, but by noon, Ben was forced to admit that he had no idea what he was doing. The group was tired and hungry, their legs hurting and the fire in them now quenched by the mist as they turned back towards the campsite. Ben seemed completely demoralized. Catherine finally put a hand on his shoulder, reminding him that they were exhausted and needed to eat, and he was finally forced to turn around and head back to camp. They had covered the whole island, beach to beach, and found no sign of Janet or anyone else. As they trudged back, Ben wasn't the only one looking downtrodden. They all knew that come morning, they would likely be 5 instead of 6. Liz sat by the fire now, remembering the last few days with sobering clarity. Ben had been taken next. He had tried to stay up and keep watch, wanting to catch this thing so he could keep them safe from it. But in the end, he had succumbed and fallen asleep. They had all been so tired after trudging through the jungle, but when they woke up, he was already gone. Kathy was next, and Gregory's cries had brought the rest of them around the next morning. By then, the 4 of them had been frantic. No one wanted to be next, but it seemed inevitable. They were all tired, their meals growing smaller as their numbers dwindled, and they were utterly trapped by the island they now found themselves on. They couldn't fight him. They couldn't escape him. They were nothing but cattle, just waiting for the slaughter. Catherine went next, but by then, Liz already thought she knew what she had to do. When he returned the following night, she was waiting for him. He seemed confused when he found her awake, Maria and Gregory snoring around her, and when she put a finger to her lips, his nod made her stomach churn. "What will you do when they're all gone?" she asked, watching the fire dance between them as the mist made it hiss. He didn't answer her, his red eyes boring into her as he hunkered and watched. "You seem to be saving me for last. Do you hate me so much that you'd make me watch the people I care about disappear before it's my turn?" "Never," he blurted, and she shushed him as Gregory stirred. "I would never torture you like that. It's only that I can't bring myself to hurt you. I need to eat to survive, but I hate that it must come at the expense of you." They pondered this for a moment, the fire hissing and spitting like an angry cat. "What if I went with you now? Would you let these two go and take me?" He was silent, but his nod was all the answer she needed. "Lift the mist and let them go, and I'll go with you." He seemed startled. I can't promise your safety. It's hard for me to control my hunger, as you've seen. I'm not sure I could forgive myself if I hurt you. I'm sure you'll have no trouble calling more boats here, just like you did to ours, right?" The eyes looked away sheepishly, but he didn't bother to deny it. "How did you know?" "I guessed. Just like I guessed that this ring might be stopping your song from calling me away at night. Right?" He nodded again. "It won't protect you, though, if I decided to just gobble you up one day when I got hungry." "It's a chance I'll have to take," she said, getting up and walking towards him. The red eyes widened, but as she walked into the mist that surrounded him, the cold membrane encompassed her and accepted her. Liz felt conflicted as she watched the boat leave with Maria and Gregory. The sound of the deep whistle had brought the two around as the sun rode high in the morning, and Maria had called her name for quite a while before leaving with the boy. The ship had seen the messages on the beach, seen the smoke from their fires, and Liz had been afraid that Maria wouldn't go for a minute. As the boat grew smaller and smaller on the horizon, a part of Liz wished she was on it. Another part had already accepted that this was her new home, as certain as she was that she belonged with the man whose strange hand now clutched at hers. As strange as it sounded, this had been the trip she wanted. Her old life seemed so dull now. Harold and her children had already started to fade as she stood beside this strange creature. As she turned to look at him, she wondered if she would become like him one day. Maybe he had been like her once, before being discovered by something like him. Maybe he had left a life like hers behind, sacrificing everything because it felt right. Regardless, this was her home now, and as she turned to look at him, she felt complete in a way that she had never felt before.
Sometimes those vacations turn out to be more than you bargained for. Coming up next, we have a story about some home invaders that find a little bit more than they were looking for as well. So be sure you read those signs when they warn you to beware of dog.
It should have been an easy score. Rob an old man, leave without much fuss. We never could have guessed how south it would go. Everyone had heard of Duncan Adams. He'd been a fixture in the community for generations, living in that wild old house up on Mount Yaller. He'd been a writer, a professor of antiquities at Georgia State College, and any number of other things. His house was supposed to contain all sorts of expensive things, and we were going to see if the rumors were true. Mike didn't like it, though. Guy like that is certain to have all sorts of security, the best measures money can buy, and you just expect the four of us to walk in like it's nothing. Julius, Gavin, Mike, and I like to call ourselves a crew, but that was just from watching too many heist movies. In reality, we were just four guys who like to break into people's houses and steal things. We weren't druggies, we weren't criminals, despite what our records said, but we did like to buy nice things, and stealing often paid for them better than a real job. You'd think so, I said, but my brother went up there to do a job and said that there were no security systems, no cameras, no nothing. The dude is just asking to get robbed, and I say we take him up on it. My youngest brother's a plumber, and that was actually where I got the idea for the job. He got called about a month ago to fix some pipes in the old man's bathroom, and came back to tell us how cool the place was. He had all these mirrors on the grounds, and in the house, and on the walls, and it was like a fun house. It was really cool looking, he said. The old man had paid him a mint to do the job, and I'd spent the next 3 weeks thinking about that house, and planning the biggest heist that I could imagine. plan is that we go in just after dark and jump the sidewall. We can go in through the garden out back and come out on the back porch and into the house. The old man's a hard sleeper. My brother said he had to ring the bell 12 times before he woke up. We can go in and out before he even knows we're there and live like fat rats off the spoils. Mike still wasn't sure, but greed was slowly eroding his sense of self-preservation. He said he would bring it to a vote with the rest of the crew, and later that afternoon he called to say that the vote had been carried unanimously. The other two were in, and Mike wasn't about to hold us up with some tickling feeling of doubt. Hope your intel's right, because if you're not, we're all going to be royally screwed. And that was how we came to be hunkered in the scrub around the Duncan Adams estate, waiting for it to get good and dark. We were all dressed in dark clothes, Jules and Gavin wearing ski masks, while Mike and I just had our hoods pulled up. I was pretty sure that we wouldn't need cover, but Jules had 2 prior arrests, and Gavin was clean for the moment. Both wanted to stay out of prison, if they could help it, and had opted to cover their faces. As the dark began to settle around us, we kept to the fence and prepared to vault over. It was just a simple concrete wall, no lights or cameras on the top. But Mike stopped before making a stirrup with his hands to point at a sign on the wall. You didn't say nothing about a dog. I looked at the sign, wrinkled my brow as I tried to remember if Lewis had mentioned a dog. He hadn't. He'd said nothing about any kind of animals on the property, but a dog could complicate things. The sign was the usual black and yellow one that bore the legend, "Beware of dog," on it, but it looked a little faded, and I suddenly wondered if it was something from a while ago. It's probably old. Lewis didn't say anything about a dog or a cat or anything to do with animals. Mike seemed unsure, but I doubled down. Tell you what, I'll go first and drop behind the gate. If there's a dog, it'll just tear me up, and I'll find some way to get out, or you guys can run. We'll only be out for the gas it took to get us here, and I'll have spent a night in jail, worst case scenario. Mike still looked unsure, but he made a stirrup with his hands, and I vaulted over the wall and landed in a well-kept backyard. It had been landscaped to look oriental, maybe Japanese or something, and there was a bridge over a little creek and a well-cared-for walkway that led to the back of the house. There was a sand pit with rocks in it, some trees cut to resemble bonsai trees, and several large reflective columns interspaced around. It was definitely different, but I liked it the longer I stood waiting to get mauled by a Rottweiler or a pit bull. "What do you see?" Mike whispered, as I scanned the area for a slobbering beast that was just waiting to strike. "Nothing. Well, not nothing, but no dog. Come on over. I think it's safe." They dropped over one at a time, Mike reaching back to pull Gavin over before landing himself. They all stared at the strange little garden, so alien in the twilight, and when no lights came on to mark them, and no dog came out to chase us away, we all sighed collectively. "Looks like there wasn't a dog after all," Julia said. "Or he's inside," Mike said skeptically. "Whatever. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We gotta get inside first," I reminded them, as we set off across the little garden path. It was a little eerie to walk across the shadowy garden with only the moon to guide us. The place seemed to be made of strange angles, and the reflective monoliths didn't help matters much. They were everywhere, a new one jutting up every 7 or 8 feet, and they played strange games in the moonlight. I would catch myself looking at them out of the corner of my eye, and more than once I had to turn and make sure something wasn't following us. The reflections created strange shadows, and I was sure I saw something dart out of sight before turning to find nothing and nowhere that it could have gone. "These things are weird," Julia said, keeping his voice pitched low. "I could swear I keep seeing something in them, but it's gone when I look." "Me too," Gavin said, sounding a little unnerved. "Eyes on the prize, boys," I reminded them, but I didn't sound as sure as I tried to convey. The backyard hadn't looked very big, but as we moved towards the house, it seemed to go on forever. We were staying low, trying not to draw attention to ourselves, but it seemed like we should have been there by now. Whenever I looked at the back porch, it always seemed to be about 50 feet away, and every step seemed to bring us no closer. "What the hell was that?" Gavin asked, and his voice was too high. Julia shushed him, whispering back, "What are you talking about?" "There it was again, right there, I saw it," Gavin said, pointing at one of the polished monoliths. I glanced at it, but it was just a flat reflection of the weird trees sitting on the back wall. "There's nothing there, Gav. Get it together, man. In a few hours we'll be leaving with more loot than we can carry. Then you can freak out if you still want to." Gavin looked unsure, but he nodded and kept pace as we made our way through the collection of old trees and topiaries. He wasn't the only one getting a little nervous, though. I could see something in those reflections, too. Something I was beginning to think might be our dog. It was big. Way too big to go vanishing like it always seemed to. It was a mastiff or a wolf hybrid or something, and the longer we trekked through the garden, the closer it seemed to get to us. At first it was just curiously observing us, seeing what we were doing, and enjoying its little game of startling us. As we neared the house, though, the game changed. Now it was getting closer to our group, weaving between the statues and plants, getting bigger as it stalked us. I still wasn't sure how it was doing that. The thing had to be nearly 5 feet tall on all fours, but it would disappear any time I turned to look behind me. I wondered if there was some sort of electrical gadget in these things, maybe a display mount to scare intruders, but when I looked right at the polished mirror front, I saw nothing but my own reflection and the larger-than-usual bonsai topiary behind me. I'd like to tell you that we made it to the house before things went sideways, but that's not true. Truth was, we never even saw the inside of the house. We came within about 10 feet of the back porch, a trip that seemed to take longer than it should have, when the purpose of the monoliths became apparent. We were hunched around some of the oddities of the garden, trying to get our nerve up before heading in. Gavin and I weren't the only ones that had been seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, and nerves were high as the goal came into view. Now the real work would begin, but we weren't sure what to expect from this funhouse garden. Would we be allowed to make it to the house? Would we be mowed down by some huge hound on our way to the porch? I didn't know, but suddenly this didn't seem like the easy score I had promised them. "Jules," I whispered, "go see if the back door is unlocked." "Why have I got to do it?" Jules asked, his nerves jangling a little. "'Cause you're the closest to the door. Just get up there and see." Jules looked at the house like it was the absolute last place he wanted to go, but greed still had its teeth in him. We could still make something of this, still come out okay, and he scampered up the porch steps with all the stealth he could muster. The doors were glass, fronting on a huge glassed-in kitchen, and when Jules reached out for the handle, he seemed as shocked as we were when it pulled down easily. Damn, guy's not even... But as he took his eyes off the glass, I saw something loom up behind him, something that made me tremble. It was the dog, a huge black hellhound with a gaping maw full of sharp teeth and piercing red eyes. It was behind the glass, and I thought for sure that it would jump through and bury Jules with its bulk. I started to yell, started to warn him, but when it leaned out of the glass and snapped its teeth around him, I was surprised by the lack of a crash. Jules looked surprised too, his shock absolute, and when the creature yanked him into the glass and out of sight, we were left in stunned silence, with only the crickets for company. "What the hell was that?" Gavin said, his voice trembling audibly. "I don't know," Mike said, his voice inches behind me as he inched away with every breath, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." He was off and running then, tearing back towards the wall we'd come over. He looked scared enough to jump it without any help, and when I called for him to stop, I winced as a light came on in the house. Great, we'd woken up the old man. Gavin saw the light and took a few steps back himself. But when Mike screamed suddenly, Gavin and I froze as we turned back to see what had happened. In the fleeting rays of the porch light, I saw Mike caught beneath the massive paws. It was coming from the surface of a polished square, and as the head emerged, the beast looked as big as a grizzly bear. The fur was wiry and stiff, something I believe they called brindled in the dog world, and its muzzle was already dripping with blood. It bent down over Mike, the poor guy screaming and thrashing as much as his smushed lungs would allow, and when it covered his head with its mouth, the crying and yelling was cut off abruptly. It took Mike's head with it, but was nice enough to leave the body behind as it disappeared into the polished surface of the brooding rectangle. Gavin and I just stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. When the door to the back porch opened, we both got low as we tried to hide from whoever had come to check on the ruckus. "Who's there?" said a voice that had probably once been a little more impressive. Age had done it no favors, and now it was a little less impressive, a little less commanding. But the owner seemed to know that he wasn't the most dangerous creature in the garden. The sound of a cane thumping on the boards could be heard, and when he saw the body, he croaked out a rough laugh. "Decided to come and steal from an old man, huh? You didn't think you were the first, did you?" I looked at Gavin as we hid, trying to tell him to be still, though he seemed to be losing that particular fight. "More than a few people have thought that they could come and plunder what I've rightfully taken in my prime. They see an old man living alone and think to make his home their find of the century. They never guess that the most dangerous thing here might be my own biggest find." As we watched, the old man put out a hand, and the hellish beast stuck its nose out of the window it had sucked jewels into, so the old man could scratch it like any other dog. "I was excavating a tomb in Russia when I found them. These strange black monoliths were just in a cave towards the back of the old tomb. I had never seen anything like them or the beast they held, but it had enough intelligence to understand me when I made it an offer. It didn't seem to be enough that he was going to kill us. The old codger meant to monologue before his hell beast devoured us. 'Come back to my home,' I said. 'Come into the lighted world again, and I will take you from this place and let you hunt my enemies for me.' And so I have. It has hunted a long time on would-be thieves and robbers, and eaten well in the process. You will be no different." Gavin looked at the back wall, a path that would take him over the unmoving corpse of Mike, and seemed to be trying to decide if it was worth the risk. I shook my head at him, trying to tell him not to, but when he suddenly sprinted across the lawn, I found myself right behind him. I could no more stop myself from fleeing in my terror than he could, and we dodged around the monoliths at every opportunity. The hound lunged at us nonetheless, coming out of either side as it tried to stop us. We were neck and neck, nearly to the wall, when Gavin suddenly tripped. I looked back and found that Gavin's foot was stuck in a trap too devilish to escape. The creature had him by the ankle, and as it dragged him backwards, I sprinted for the wall and leapt at the top. My fingers burned as they tried to dig into the concrete, and I'm not ashamed to say that I left a few fingernails behind as I scrambled over the top. I drove home, expecting that the creature or the police would come after me every mile of the way. When it didn't come lunging out of my rearview mirror and no blue and whites dogged my heels, I breathed a sigh of relief. I drove home, locked all the doors in my trailer, and went to my room so I could write this down while it's still fresh. Now that I have, I'm not sure what to do. Do I call the police? What would I even tell them? Can that thing get me through my own mirror? My computer monitor? The surface of my spoons? I don't know what to do. But I do know one thing. If you ever hear of Duncan Adams and his strange house in the mountains, and think that an old man living alone will be an easy score, think again. The dog that he has can't be bribed with treats and pets, and all you'll have from that place is death for you and anyone who comes along with you.
One more story for you, and I think we've got a pretty good one to go out on. It's a story about a man who's in trouble for the actions of another that he may have brought into existence. Let's hear a story about a ghostwriter.
Mr. Fuller. The tall man looked up through the curtain of greasy black bangs, and his face was equal parts good-natured annoyance and unshakable certainty. Detective Cutter liked the annoyance. Annoyed men could become angry, and angry men could make mistakes. But the certainty was going to make this exchange difficult. A man who was certain was a man who would play the game to win, and Detective Cutter was just as certain that this man was guilty. "Do you know why you're here?" Cutter asked, and he put the box down between them as he stood leaning over Fuller. He could not have done this if Fuller was standing. Of course, if Fuller had been any further into 6 feet, he would have been playing basketball somewhere instead of writing crime novels. Cutter was all of 5 feet, and only because his red Irish curls put him over the limit. He stood over Fuller now, though, not glowering, but not smiling, from a position of power that Fuller's certain and almost bright smile did not seem to understand. The game was over in the 9th inning, Holmes, and now it was all over but the crying. Fuller looked up at him like a professor looking at a bright pupil who's just broken the cardinal rule and asked a foolish question. "Don't you know?" he asked in a deep, cultured voice that made Cutter want to start slapping him. "I assumed that you must have after 2 officers came to my office to collect me." "Collect you?" Cutter snorted. "Mr. Fuller, you were arrested, Mirandized, and placed in an interrogation room. I'd say that's about as far from collected as it gets." "Come on, Officer Cutter. We both know that if you could charge me with anything, we wouldn't be here having this little chat right now." Cutter grabbed the chair next to him and spun it so he could lean against the back as he sat. It was a distinctly juvenile posture, but he accepted it as he settled in for the long match. He was tired, bone-weary from chasing this guy's shadow for the last 3 weeks, and he'd be damned if he'd let him slip away now. Marcus Fuller was going to answer for these murders if he had to sit here all week, and Cutter was settling in for the long run. "My captain likes you for this. Hell, I like you for this, and we have solid evidence that if you didn't pull the trigger yourself, then you know who did." Fuller just rolled his eyes. "And why would I want to commit murder? I'm a very successful writer with 2 Sunday Times bestseller noir awards. I live very comfortably, and I could easily retire from writing after my next book and maintain that comfort for the rest of my life. Why would I jeopardize that by killing prostitutes and thugs?" "Let's talk about that prostitute, shall we?" Cutter said as he reached into the box and took a thick manila envelope out. He flipped it open onto 2 pictures of a pretty brunette in her early 40s. The top photo showed her inviting guests into a newly opened Royal Casino, while the bottom was her being booked a few years before for solicitation. Her expression was the same in both photos, devil-may-care attitude with a side order of iron poise. Marjorie Dyer, the proprietor of Dyer Needs, was found murdered in her suite at the Seawind Resort. He flipped the page, and behind it were several shots of a glassy-eyed Marjorie, who was no longer poised or so devil-may-care. She lay naked across a hotel bed, with a long, angry cut from one ear to the other, and a thick collar of blood clotting around the wound, making it hard to see. Hotel staff received a noise complaint about 11, and hotel security found her that way at 11:30. He had hoped the grisly scene would shock Fuller. He had hoped for revulsion, hoped Fuller would turn green or be sick in the wastebasket, or even that he would appear excited by the photos and tip his hand in front of the detective. Instead, he studied them for a moment and then looked back at Cutter expectantly. "Very graphic, Officer Cutter. What does this have to do with me?" Detective Cutter reached into the box as he spoke. The murder scene of Marjorie Dyer is nearly the same as the killing of Catherine Hoff in your book Hunter City. He removed a dog-eared paperback from the box, and Fuller didn't seem at all surprised to see it. If you'll indulge me, Mr. Fuller, and before Fuller could protest, Cutter had opened the book to the paragraph in question. Hold her, Jack. I'm about to send Regis a message. As the switchblade came to life, Kat began to struggle between Jack and Anthony. Her tears made black pools of her mascara, and when Hunter lifted her chin to look her in the eye, she had long tracks down either side of her face. He waggled the blade in front of her, and she cringed away as the steel glinted in her eyes. Please, Glenn, please don't do this. We could make a deal. I'll work for you instead of Regis, but please don't hurt me. And she dissolved into shuddering sobs again. She stopped when Hunter pressed the edge against her throat. It's nothing personal, Kat. It's just business. She sighed like a split seam as the knife parted her flesh and her blood poured across the swell of her modest breasts. When Hunter's gentleman released her, she fell back onto the bed with a kind of boneless grace. Hunter only spared her a final glance before he strode into the hall and left her alone in his makeshift abattoir. Fuller indulged him as he read, and when Cutter finished, he only sat expectantly. "What do you make of that, Mr. Fuller?" Cutter asked, when it seemed Fuller would not break the silence. "Seems like a fan of my work decided to reenact some of his favorite scenes. As I told you the first time you came snooping around my office, I was at a charity event that night. 12 people will corroborate that I was present until well past midnight. So unless I'm under arrest for writing a compelling crime drama, are you familiar with the murder of Gerald and Jamal Smith, Mr. Fuller?" Cutter cut him off mid-sentence. Men like Fuller hated to be cut off, and he felt confident that the act would unnerve him. It didn't. "I'm afraid I'm not," Fuller said, crossing his arms and appraising Detective Cutter with light disapproval. They were hired muscle for Selectman Kane, a local crime boss in the area, all three of whom also bear a striking resemblance to Boyle, Barker, and Regis Angel from Hunter Street. Fuller rolled his eyes and sighed deeply in his throat. Do tell. Both Gerald and Jamal were visiting a tavern below Kane's office when their drinks were spiked with rohypnol. Both were large men, Mr. Fuller, and both had a lot of experience with guns, as did Boyle and Barker. Boyle and Barker, as you recall, were drugged by Glenn Hunter before he assailed the home of Regis Angel. Both sets were shot on the stairs as they tried to return to their boss. Their nerves dulled, they were easy prey for both Glenn Hunter and our current mystery killer. Then, of course, there's the nature of Selectman Kane's death. "Let me guess," said Fuller. "Drowned in the bath?" Cutter flipped through the file and settled it back on the table. "Close. Drowned in the sink." The photos were of a man in his late 50s, lying face up in a utility sink. His shoulders had been forced down into the wide basin, and his face was a spiderweb of cuts and scratches where the faucet had battered him. One of his eyes bulged grotesquely, as the other stared glassily at the photographer. Fuller looked at this with no more interest than he had the others, and when he looked up, his eyes questioned Cutter on what he hoped to accomplish. He didn't catch Selectman Kane in the bath. He was forced to improvise by drowning him in a utility sink. Kane fought, but forensics says his attacker finally broke his back and forced him down into the utility sink to properly drown him. That's not from one of my books, Officer Cutter, as well you know. No, but Hunter did drown Regis in a bathtub after killing his bodyguards in a stairwell. I got the passage somewhere here. He removed his copy of Hunter Street from the box as well. He turned to the back and saw Fuller wince as he bent the pages back to read the highlighted paragraph. That's more of a reaction than he had given to the entire photo album, Cutter thought, as his eyes found the spot. Hunter watched as Wagner's eyes went wide as he pushed through the bathroom door. Wagner reached for the gun in his jacket, but the little silenced pistol in Hunter's hand woofed softly. He felt the angry burn as the acoustics of the bathroom turned the Rise of the Valkyries into a cover for the loud, wet slap of the body as it hit the floor. Hunter entered the small door between the bathroom and the washroom unnoticed. As he pushed the large form of Regis Angel under the water, he was rewarded with total surprise. The old man was still quite strong, and had it not been for the surprise of the attack and the slippery bathtub in which he was lounging, Hunter thought that he would have been in for a real fight. As he drowned him, he bent over him so he could watch the life leave his eyes. If you watch a powerful man draw his last breath, some of his spirit will be transferred to you, boy. His grandfather had told him this 1,000 times if he'd told him once. As the struggling stopped and the great shadow of Regis Angel left the world, however, Hunter felt little save the deep sense of satisfaction and a staggering sense of loss. "You're reaching, Detective," Fuller scoffed, but Cutter noticed the change in title, and it seemed a victory, if a small one. "He was drowned on his back, Mr. Fuller, which leads us to believe his attacker wanted to watch him die." "Which supports the theory of a copycat," Fuller barked, pushing up from his seat to glower at Cutter. "Just because you beat this dead horse over and over again, Detective, does not mean it's going to give you anything but... Your third book was a bit of a disappointment, wouldn't you say, Mr. Fuller?" That shut him right up. He stopped mid-sentence and goggled at Cutter, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. If Fuller wanted to play the copycat game, Cutter was ready to drop his final bit of damning evidence. He was more than happy to let Fuller back himself into the corner first, though. Fuller blew out a long breath. "I don't see how that's relevant at all to your case." "A dozen rewrites, not well received by the fans, and the reception at the ending was bad enough that you had to write a fourth book and turn the Hunter trilogy into a Hunter quartet. That had to sting a little, wouldn't you say?" That was a decision I made on my own," he snapped, but Cutter didn't care. He had this guy, and he knew it. The first 2 pieces were only appetizers, and after he served up the main course, he'd be more than happy to give this guy his just desserts. "Well, the most recent murder was very reminiscent of another scene from your book." "Oh, please do tell. Someone kill a big stupid brute on the street with a machine gun? Poison a congressman? Maybe slit a whore up the..." Cutter threw down an open folder and watched the pompous prick deflate like an old balloon. "We had to request the manuscript from his secretary when we found out you had written a 4th novel. She was so distraught that she sent it over immediately. This, Mr. Fuller, is the reason you're here." Fuller looked far more unsettled by these photos than anything else that day. This can't be. I just talked to Dan last week. Danforth Wild was murdered in his apartment last week, 3 days after you threatened him over social media for stealing the premise of Hunter State for his noir series. You said you would make him regret every word he published, didn't you? I guess maybe he regrets it now, doesn't he? Fuller sat, looking at the pages for several seconds, before closing his eyes and sighing. He was eviscerated, just like the congressman in Hunter's stand. My agent was the only one who had a copy of the manuscript, so of course, you think... He closed the folder and glared at Cutter. "Hook me to a lie detector, Detective. Call my assistant and ask her where I was when Dan was killed. I have no receipts for travel, I have taken no leave from work, and you will find no way I could have done these things. Now, unless you're prepared to hold me under suspicion, I demand that you release me." Cutter stared at him for nearly a minute before shaking his head with a deep sigh. He had hoped he could grill the answers out of Fuller, but the guy was too slick for that. His captain was going to rake him over the coals for this one, and Cutter could already hear the sounds of pens signing his leave of absence. "Go, then," he said, waving his hand at the door, and Fuller left with a little slam as the door shut behind him. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of suspension from duty. Cutter drained the whiskey from his glass and slid it back towards Mike. He had had his first drink right here at the Fighting Cock, and he suspected it would be where he took his last. You shake enough trees like he had, and you were bound to have something fall on you eventually. Guys like Fuller, though, they made him ache for a drink. The door jingled, and Cutter didn't even look up as someone plopped down next to him. They thought I might find you here," said a familiar, cultured voice. "I need your help." Cutter blew a chuckle into his shot as he knocked it back. "You dance around justice, get me suspended for 3 weeks, and expect me to..." He flinched a little when he looked at him. Fuller had a long, jagged cut across his face, and his left eye looked like a few more punches would have broken the socket. He caught Mike's eye, and the barman seemed to be trying to decide whether to call the police or let Cutter handle this. In the end, he offered him a rag from behind the bar and slouched off out of earshot. Fuller sat down next to him, and his eyes darted towards the door like a trapped animal. I need you to protect me. The man who's been murdering these people has been staying with me for several months now. He's also responsible for the 4th Hunter book, and until tonight, I thought his killings were something benign, a way to clean up the streets, if you will. When I confronted him about Dan, though, he just went crazy and tried to kill me in my apartment. Slow down, said Cutter, as he took a pad from his pocket. Let me get some information first. He wobbled a little on his stool as the alcohol settled over him like a cloud. The shots were beginning to catch up with him, but he wanted to be sure he got everything verbatim. If he could bring this information to his captain, then maybe they'd rescind his suspension. Let's start with a name. Who tried to kill you? Fuller took a deep breath before saying the last name Cutter would have ever expected. Glenn Hunter.
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But don't worry, I'll be here to keep you company throughout the week, here on Cozy Horror. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.